Well, welcome back, everyone. Going to talk today about ethical decision making in leadership and sport and recreation. And again, as we move forward this week, a lot of our focus is going to be on the process of making decisions. We've kind of talked a little bit about the background material. We'll get into some more today that helps us make good, sound decisions. And then we'll look at some strategies of how to go about doing it. And then you'll have the opportunity to implement those strategies in your case studies that are coming up and applying them in those activities. So let's take a look at ethical decision making. And again, I know you've had ethics and moral reasoning in our program, but kind of as a foundation, we got to just just recap this as we move forward. So hopefully some of this is review for you. All right, let's go here. So defining some of the terms, ethics. It's basically just a systematic study of values that govern our decisions and our behaviors of an individual. And it really comes back to character, and it really focuses on that individual. The word ethics comes from ethos, which is a Greek word for character. So that's kind of where we start off with understanding ethics, is looking at the individual and understanding their values that govern the decision. Again, sounds familiar. We've talked about values earlier in the semester. And so just kind of threw this up here as well to just remember values play an integral role in decision making, and in this case it plays an integral role in ethics. What do we see as being important? So this is the individual beliefs that motivate, guide all of behavior. And you did a great job in your post telling me what your values are, or at least giving me an idea what your values are, or what you saw your values as being at this one particular point in time. And values do change, so not as much, but they do change because based upon what's happening in our lives. Okay. Then we have norms. Another key element of understanding ethics is norms, and norms. Well, ethics dealt with the individual. Norms are going to deal more with group or societal standards. What are those generally held criteria for acceptable conduct? What's appropriate attitude? What's commitment? What's that expectation that kind of society has created and groups create? You can probably think of norms that you, as a part of a group, maybe a sports team or a group of friends that you had, and you create norms, what that expectation of behavior, what expectation of conduct should be. You can see norms taking place, kind of a simple one to think of is, all right, it's all right to pat someone on the rear end on the playing field, but you come out of that context and move out into the business world or everyday life, and you don't go around patting everybody on the butt and saying great job. That's a norm in one situation, but and acceptable in one situation, but not acceptable in another situation. And so think about those norms. Maybe it's how you have your hair, how a tattoo that you might get, the way that you dress. There's norms of what is appropriate, what somebody in that particular group should do. And then we commonly use or talk about ethics. We also talk about morals, and morals come from this idea of behavior that's guided by the community or culture, actions, behavior, principles that guide the community or a culture. It's basically enacting the ethical principles, but on a larger scale, and it's usually kind of comes down from rules and guidelines. And some will say, well, you don't really know where the morals came from. They just arise because that's the way we do things. But we do have those morals that exist out there that help, again, guide a societal way of doing things. Okay? So as we look, and I do have some supportive videos for you to watch dealing with A lot of these topics, difference between morals and ethics, looking at some of these additional ethical basis or theories as we move forward in discussing. And so I do have some videos there for you to take a look at to help probably do a better illuminating these circumstances than what I do. But deontology and teleology are two ethical bases or theories that exist to kind of help us and guide behavior that we talked about. And so when we look at this, deontological is basically a rules-based approach. It's focusing on obligation and duty. It's similar to the orientation found in the Bible. You know, the Ten Commandments. These are those things that everybody supposedly should follow. And that's what this. Here's our rules. You follow those rules. If I'm a buy into this ethical approach, I am really rules driven. There's no black or white. It's just whatever the rule says. That's what I'm going to do. Okay, and so we follow those because that's what the rule says we should do. The repercussions of the decision are of no consequence. We're just guided by that principle. Okay? We're guided by those principles that come out in those rules, and that's what guides all our behavior. And the consequence doesn't matter. We're doing it because that's what we're supposed to do. And so we focus. A deontological approach focuses on what's right. There's right, there's wrong, and you're going to focus on whatever is right. And then that's what the rules tell us to do, right? And sorry, I'm over a picture here. Let me see if I can move myself. And I'll talk about this gentleman here in a sec. So deontological is rule-based. Rules are rules. We follow our rules, and the rules are right, and that's what we're supposed to do. Okay. So it's obligation or duty, an action directed to act itself and not to the consequences. Okay. And so we're focused on what is right. Now this picture here below me is a young boy named Elijah Earnhardt. And Elijah is 12 years old, or at this time of this picture was 12 years old. He was 6'1", 297 pounds. 12-year-old, 6'1", 297 pounds. Okay. He wanted to play Pee Wee football. The rules for Pee Wee football, okay, deontological approach, the rules are the rules, and the rules are what's right. We follow the rules. He's 162 pounds over the 135-pound weight limit to play Pee Wee football. Okay, so based upon deontological approach, he can't play. Okay, is that right? The consequence isn't what's important. The rules are what's important. Okay, based upon this approach. Okay, so in this case, this young gentleman couldn't play in that league because he was too big. Okay. The teleological approach kind of is a little bit different than the deontological. This one, let me move me here again, if I can find, move me back down into the corner, is an approach that focuses on consequences now of the action. It's now more important about the consequence and not the rules. Okay, not what's right. It's about what's good. Okay. Oops. And so there's a goodness and badness to it. So now we get into a gray area, in a little bit of gray area. Deontological, there's right and wrong. There's no gray area. In this one, we're looking at everything has a degree of goodness and badness, and based upon our behavior and those consequences that come from that behavior. And so we have to focus on the consequence in particular, rather than looking at the act itself. And so we have to determine, looking at this, what is good, and weighing the good versus the bad. So we're focused on the consequences. It measures the amount of goodness or badness that arises from the behavior. And what we do is make the decision for the greatest good of the most people. So we want to look at what's going to have the most benefit for the most amount of people. Okay, and so the and one of the big, if you think about sport, and then from a sport perspective, one thing that kind of looking at this teleological approach is that, okay, we put in kind of things in place, and we have to judge what's going to be the outcome, and is it going to be good, and how much good is it going to do, and who's going to do the most good for. So if you think about sport in the sport industry, one of the things that came out, and as an example in sport, is Title IX. Okay, well, think about Title IX. Came out in 1972. At that point in time, there was 300,000 young girls and women participating in intercollegiate and high school sport. Now there's 3.2 million. Okay, so we see a great impact happening for women and women athletics and as a whole. But there is a downside to Title IX. Okay, and there was a downside to Title IX. We're still seeing issues coming out with Title IX. On a downside is that it hindered some men's sports. A lot of schools dropped men's wrestling, men's gymnastics. You don't see those as much as you used to, because one of the ways that schools had to and tried to overcome Title IX as far as that equality was they dropped men's sport, and those were two of the men's sports that got dropped most commonly. Most of us that doesn't affect, but for those wrestlers and those male gymnasts, so we had to balance it out. What's going to be the best for the most amount of people? Jumping up in 3.2 million women participating, and it only hurts a few males. Well, we had to balance it out and make a decision what's going to be the best there. Okay, and so when you look at deontological, if you're that person that just follows the rules, and if it's in the rules, then it's okay with you, and that's what you're going to do, and you're going to focus on the act itself. Okay, that's fine. Teleological, now we're okay. It's not such a black and white. It's more of a gray. We look at balancing out the goodness versus the badness, and helping us make decisions based upon that, and looking at our ethics there. Okay, so keep that in mind as we move forward. Okay. So ethical dilemmas, and as we look at these ethical dilemmas, ethical dilemmas exist when action has potential to harm or benefit others. Okay, just like any dilemma, we have the opportunity to harm or benefit people, right, or others, or sometimes ourselves. That's where we get into some issues. I've put in a clip here about a high school football incident where two young gentlemen basically attacked the official during the game, and you can watch that to see the ethical dilemma. Basically, the coach told them to do it, is what they're saying. The World Cup, one of the FIFA, probably one of the most corrupt agencies out there, and a real interesting video that's available to look at all the corruption that goes on in the World Cup, but is what's going to be the most good for the most amount of people. The Olympics, this was an interesting one. When the Olympics were held in Beijing, they basically brought a lot of good into China. A lot of people came into China, and a good opportunity to promote China. But in the efforts to build the facilities, they displaced residents. About 1.5 million people in China were displaced to build the facilities. It's kind of a challenge to look on. And then always the performance-enhancing drugs in sport, and what what's the harm versus the benefit there. Okay. I'm going to have to stop here, and there's a whole lot more of ethical dilemmas we can look at, but those are the ones that kind of common. I'm going to stop here, and